Thank you, Steffi. Great, as always, to be here. So you had two presentations back to back, one about innovation, one about regulation. And I thought that our two people who haven't spoken might quickly like to respond to the two presentations earlier so that we can begin to think about regulation versus innovation in the AI space. Ludwig, why don't you start? In the summer on the AI event, you gave a spectacularly good overview, I thought, of our current state of the AI economy. Things have moved on. Eva talked about future-proof. I'm not sure that's possible with AI since we don't know what the future is. But what's your sense, Ludwig, in terms of these two presentations of innovation versus regulation when it comes to AI?
Yeah. Well, with the innovation bit, I think that's easier. I think we're going to have a lot of it, hopefully a lot of it driven by Aleph Alpha and many others here in Europe. I think when it comes to regulation, in my mind, it's a little bit less clear. I think the proposal that you've spearheaded is obviously in many parts very intelligent. I think it's very good that it has this risk evaluation component at its core. I think that's absolutely necessary, and I think that's great. The wider question that I would have really is, do we need this now, right? Are we convicting AI of a pre-crime, right? I mean, nothing's really happened bad yet with AI. And so the question is, why do we need to regulate, especially in a field that's evolving so quickly that basically things we knew a year or 2 years ago look like ancient literature now. And if we look at this 3 years from now, the state of the art of technology and the applications, I think, are going to be so different that it'll be hard to recognize them at the pace at which we're moving. I think, to me, it's important that we identify a few key areas where we think that AI can seriously go wrong, can seriously do harmful things, and that we install a mechanism similar to maybe the one we have in drug testing with the FDA in the US and the European bodies, where we say, let's sandbox and test these things that can possibly lead to catastrophic events. But for, I think, the widest area of applications, 95%, 99% of all things that use AI, I would welcome it if we would just regulate according to endpoints, right? So if you want to be against fraud, if you want to be against misinformation, that's great, and we should regulate and put laws in charge, but then punish the crime and not the algorithm or the method that leads to it, because I think that's going to be quite difficult to implement in practice. And I guess those I think are generally the points where I stand in terms of regulation.
Oh dear, Eva, I don't know if this crowd is very sympathetic to regulation. Philipp, what's Google's position on regulation, for or against?
So Andrew, you teed this up as an innovation versus regulation conversation, and I frankly think we need to move beyond that, because it's not a case of one or the other. Clearly, we need regulation for AI. The question is, what does good regulation look like for AI? AI is such a transformational new technology that will impact so many areas of our lives, of business, of science, that it's clear to us as a company, and I think it's clear to me as an individual, that we do need regulation. And Eva, you talked a lot about making sure that we get to good regulation and not just to the fastest regulation. In my sense of what I've seen so far from the compromise that has been reached in December, you've actually achieved that, because you have found an approach that is risk-based. And that, to us, was a key requirement in this, that you don't look at AI as this one big, gigantic thing and say everything needs to be regulated the same way, but you look at it from the application side of saying, what's a more or less trivial or not risky application versus what's a high-risk area. The trick there, of course, is then understanding which application goes into which of these buckets. And we're looking forward to seeing that. I think some of the technical details are yet to be published on that. But of course, I think as an industry, we want to make sure that not everything ends up in the high-risk bucket that could be interesting for the future. And Ludwig, to your point, on many of these things, we don't know quite yet what their impact can be. So from that perspective, being really mindful of which technology, which application, I should say, goes into which of these risk categories is a really critical thing. Now, on the opportunity and innovation side, I think probably everybody at DLD is excited about AI and the opportunity here, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but one of the things we did was we tried to estimate the economic impact that AI could have on Europe's economy, because that's really important to sort of dimensionalize this. So we commissioned a study last year for the economy across the European Union, saying, what if companies, businesses, society really adopted AI technologies? What would the economic contribution potentially be? And it's in the order of 1.2 trillion euros. And for Germany, that number was about 330 billion euros. So it's massive. But that requires a bold adoption. That's not going to happen on its own. It requires everything from companies embracing AI. It requires governments to embrace AI. And frankly, it requires digital skills that we don't have. We have a skills gap. Jonas, you pointed to that in your presentation, both from the age perspective and the number of open roles, and I'm with you. It's one of the biggest, I think, societal challenges we have in Europe to make sure that we sort of counter the challenges of our demographic pyramid with more digital skills. Because ultimately we will need the productivity of AI to close that demographic gap. And it's a huge opportunity, in fact. If we all become smarter and better and more productive in how we work, we can fill some of that demographic gap. So I would like to take the conversation a bit away from the versus and figure out how can we be both bold in innovation and responsible on the regulatory side and on the business side.
I have to say, Philip, we always hear this in Silicon Valley, you can have your cake and eat it, and of course you can't. Jonas, you began talking, you didn't really address the issue of regulation. From what you were saying, you seem to be suggesting that AI can solve the labor shortage in Germany. Are you sympathetic to regulation? And as a startup, there's a lot of talk in America that the big players, the Googles, the Microsofts, the OpenAIs are more sympathetic to regulation because it benefits them and it concretizes their lead. What's your position both on regulation, particularly as a genuine startup?
Yeah, great question. So we've always said that we appreciate regulation, so now is a great time to regulate AI, but we will not achieve sovereignty through regulation. Regulation takes away resources, especially a regulation, to Ludwig's point, that is basically not only looking at risk, like you said, like of course we want to look at risk, but there's no risk in fundamental technology. This is math. What's the general risk of math? Right? And now we're regulating math. And if you're doing a lot of math, you're being regulated. Right? And of course, a company like Google can hire an infinite amount of lawyers that write documents for
And
Brussels.
I have to interrupt. My wife is a lawyer at Google, so
Yes.
we want to make sure she
And they should hire a
we want to
special
make
lawyer.
sure that she keeps her job because she brings in a lot of money. But
No, but I mean, this is the regulatory capture is a thing, right? So certainly, the more complex and the more difficult markets are to enter, the more it benefits the biggest players, the established players. This is not just in AI. Like this is like we all know that, right? And then of course we can say we want regulation and innovation, and that is of course true. But there's a limited amount of AI leadership in Germany. And we are diverting so much creative energy that we need for innovation, we are diverting that to compliance. So that means this leadership is missing.
Eva, there's obviously strong feeling here. What have you learned collectively from previous legislation about, you talked about this legislation taking 2 years. 2 years ago, no one was really even talking about AI. What have you learned in terms of speed, of keeping up with this industry that moves so fast, where politics, for better or worse, moves rather slowly?
So first of all, I think I did that in September, so I decided to spare it earlier in my remarks, but I'll mention it today. I think it's important to remind ourselves why the AI Act was put in the first place on the table by the European Commission. This was before all the hype around generative AI. I was already back then quite cautious in terms of going towards a proper regulation, but AI Act was put on the table to be there to protect citizens, our fundamental values, our democratic values. It is put on the table from the perspective not of competitiveness, not of how to foster innovation or economic growth. It was put out there by the European Commission to say, we want to make sure that those systems are safe. We want to make sure that some of the few requirements that are out there are aligned with our democratic values. We would like to make sure that we foster social trust. And I believe companies that are European and companies that operate in Europe would like to continue Europe to have the same way of life, to make sure we are the most democratic continent out there. Now,
so are you saying you're more democratic than North America?
That's not the point here.
Well,
the point is I'm trying to explain why the AI Act was put in place back then. And I'm trying to explain why it was put back then on the table in this form, because what we should have been doing more, and I've been calling about that, is find other tools, other measures which can support competitiveness, which can support funding. And I've talked with Ludwig and others on the funding part. This is why we have numerous, I mean, I'm even ashamed to speak about the Capital Markets Union that are not yet completed, because it takes so much effort to do that. You need the support of member states. Earlier on in my remarks, I said we still think as 27 different member states. So once this changes, we can have the Capital Markets Union, we can have a tech sovereign fund in Europe. But until this mentality and mindset doesn't change, it would be very difficult to bring the funding and the level to the level of North America, for example. And we need these other tools and ecosystems at the same time, while making sure that those systems are aligned with our values.
Ludwig, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Firstly, you talked about something called a pre-crime, which sounded a little Orwellian. What exactly that means. And also, Eva keeps on talking about the 27 member countries uniting, but that's not very realistic, is it?
Well, the latter question maybe is a little bit above my pay grade, but I'll answer the first one.
You're a European, so you have an opinion.
So let me just maybe talk about one thing. You started, and that was your question. You started this regulation 2 years ago, and I think what's notably changed in these last 2 years, that 2 years ago, AI was this isolated thing, which was a part of maybe the entire massive software universe. Nowadays, I don't think we have a single startup in our portfolio that does software that doesn't include AI somewhere, right? So absolutely every piece of software you interact with right now has some form of AI. So I think there's a bit of a risk if you now regulate AI broadly, then you basically get into a situation where you're regulating software, essentially, right? And that, I think, is going to be extremely difficult to do in practice. So I think that is something that has notably changed since people started talking about the regulation of these systems. They're not isolated anymore. I think they're ubiquitous already. So I think that is something that is notably changed. The 27 member states uniting on this, I wish they would, definitely wish they would, and also very much would wish so with the capital markets. But I think obviously there are quite a number of hurdles around that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, on the 27 member states, just to make it clear, I do think, and we have seen numerous areas such as the support for Ukraine and many others where Europe has a united view and stands united. That's clear from at least the position where I sit. However, very often you have the national mindset kicking in before that European mindset. And this is where we would need those national politicians to also feel more European at times, because sometimes it does not matter in which European country the fab or the production facility or the company is located. But it would be great if we have more of those in Europe, irrespective where they are.
Philipp, what's the view from, I mean, you're a Google European person, but what's the view from the US, from Mountain View on this? Is it conceivable that if Europe started to more aggressively regulate AI, you might lose interest in Europe?
I don't think so at all. I think Europe is interesting to tech companies, whether it's Google or others, for many reasons, including for some of the reasons we discussed here, the democratic values, the market itself, the business opportunity both on the consumer and on the business side. It's a very attractive market. So I think to put that out there, it's an important point to start with, to say I don't see US tech companies losing interest in Europe. But Europe is becoming a bit more complicated to operate in for US tech companies. And by the way, some of the regulation in Europe is specifically focusing on US tech companies. You look at the Digital Markets Act or the Digital Services Act, those are pieces of legislation that particularly focus on larger US tech companies. And I understand the reasons for that. But I think it's fair to say it makes it more complex to operate in Europe. But I think it's also fair to say the technology industry is becoming more regulated. We are experiencing something in the technology industry that other industries have experienced in the decades before. So it's not that surprising to us that there's more regulation. It's more the question whether that regulation continues to allow for innovation to happen across the board. Because in this AI race, it's not frankly between Europe versus the US. Everybody, each part of the world, including China, is going to continue to innovate in this area. And it's really important that Europe has a framework that allows European companies, as well as international ones like us, to continue to be successful here. So it's not a question of saying Europe isn't interesting, more how do you make it less complex to operate?
Jonas, as a European entrepreneur, much of the backlash against tech these days, again, I don't need to tell you, has come from the misbehavior of large American companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook. Do you feel that in an odd way, maybe European tech companies bring a different sensibility to morality, and perhaps there may be less need to regulate European tech companies than American ones? Easy question.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily would say we should regulate these companies differently, but we should be smarter about things. Like the industrial policy in the US has a very clear focus on making their own economy strong. The industrial policy in Brussels is more ideologically driven. US tech companies have been breaking rules systematically because the damages they had to pay were so much lower than the profits they could make. They're basically running circles around our regulation. And I agree, like there's trillions of potential value based on AI in Europe, but if we're not paying attention, all that, or like a significant part of that value goes to the shareholders of the people that are running the AI. We just have to look at the cloud market. This is becoming a $1 trillion market, and the gross margin of cloud providers is 50%, right? So there's a lot of value there, but where does this value go? And of course, we'll have our share of the value, no matter how it'll end up, right? But I think we should strive to become as strong as possible, to be in a position to be a strong partner to the US. This is not US against Europe, but true friendship, true partnership can only be if both are strong to act.
Eva, very briefly, we don't have a lot of time. There's so much to discuss here. As a regulator, do you feel you have a particular responsibility to stimulate the European economy of local entrepreneurs like Jonas, in contrast to the Silicon Valley titans?
That's a yes.
Well, look, it is a yes, of course. It's an obvious yes, but in the same time, I have always stood by the principle of the necessity of collaboration and, most importantly, not comparing ourselves to the US. Our biggest competitor is not the US. We have to be working together, and I think very much in line with what Jonas said here, and understanding who are those that we need to be catching up with, who are those that are truly possessing the real threats to European competitiveness. And I would like to see more of that. If we go into a geopolitical discussion, I think it would take a very different approach with who should we be teaming up and who are the ones that we need to be worried about. If you bring other people on this panel from across the world, you would understand that Europe is losing, standing in terms of economical terms, and we need to be smart about it. We need to enable, but we need to also cooperate. Without that necessary transatlantic cooperation between democratic allies, it would be very difficult for us to lead. So that is absolutely a necessity. But of course, as a member of the European Parliament, a passionate European, I would like to see those European players to become also champions. And this is why I have been trying to navigate the discussion in Brussels, but I do need some help from that community in realizing the goals that they're not just about legislating. That's what Europe knows well. It goes beyond that. It's about enabling, it's about thinking what we've put in place. Is it working? Can it work better? Do we need to change something? It's not business as usual anymore, and we need to understand that.
I think it's one sentence. I think it's important that we all memorize that the US are our friends. If it wasn't for the US, we would all be speaking Russian by now. The US companies, like I was at Apple, and at Apple I was playing to win, and US companies are playing to win, as they should. And we should be playing to win ourselves, and then there's a strong partnership and a strong friendship between two continents.
I mean, German companies play to win as well. Look, German companies play to win as they should. I think that's super important. I think it's a little bit ironic that in a place like Germany, which is so export dependent, 50% of our GDP is driven by the fact that German companies do well by exporting. That we're having discussion this morning whether perhaps we're using too many services provided by US companies. It feels a bit ironic. The digital space is the most interconnected space where, in fact, we cannot build walls between countries, and we shouldn't, because then we will not unlock the value of digital.
Well, at least we're having the conversation in English rather than Russian. Final question is just a one or two word answer, and then we got to end. This is an ongoing conversation, regulation versus innovation. It's been going on ever since the birth of technology, even before digital technology. Are we too early or too late? Or is this the right time to be talking about somehow charting a middle ground or uniting or knitting together innovation and regulation? Has everything been set, Eva? Are we done with this? Or is this the right time to be having this conversation?
I think it's too early.
Too early, Eva?
I think you didn't start. I mean, I'm pretty certain the first car crashed before we had roadside regulation for cars and seatbelts and
Wouldn't
all of
it
these
be
things.
good?
I don't think anything seriously crashed, and we are not quite sure how it's going to crash at scale. So I think a lot of this regulation is highly intelligent, but I think it is too early, because 5 years from now, no one will even recognize the state of the technology at all, and of the applications and the risks involved. So I believe to put it in practice at scale is a little bit early, even though it's intelligent.
Too early, Eva? Very briefly.
Well, I think they should be here to listen. I spoke about the many elections that are coming up. I think it's about what citizens think about what the next process.
Too early or the right time?
I was part of it.
The right time now.
From the point of view of making sure that we enable social trust within our citizens, yes, it's a good time.
Philipp?
It's the right time, because you cannot win the AI innovation game in the long game if you don't start responsibly.
And finally, Jonas.
I think it's a little unfortunate that the global power block that is dead last with AI is leading regulation. I think it's the right time now, but we should focus on innovation and as much as possible.
Excellent. Well, thank you. That was a fascinating conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.